Fantastic. Thank you for such a kind introduction. And it's a real honor to be kicking off tonight. I'm going to start by saying that I'm currently quite unwell, if you couldn't tell by my voice, and the very heavy bags under my eyes. But today's, well, what I'm going to read from today is from the second story in All That Glisters, called Citron Sid. And every story in this book deals with an elderly character, because I spent some time living with my grandparents. And so I learned a lot from them, both their wit and experience, but also the humor and the depth of emotion that people can feel when they're matured, shall we say. And this story in particular is about a very real man. Citron Sid exists. He lives opposite my aunt and cousin, and he's very strange. And I wanted to write something that investigated why he might be the way he is. So it's fairly light-hearted, and I hope you enjoy this extract from Citron Sid. And I will begin now. Leander Street, Poppy Drive, was different to the surrounding rows. First of all, it wasn't a street at all, but rather a large alleyway between Maple Road and Blossom Street. It wasn't paved, so it was subjected to new dips and bumps after each rainfall. Only 4 houses lined Poppy Drive, 2 on the left side and 2 on the right, and each was responsible for maintaining the section of road outside their property. The second reason Leander Street was different to the others was that it was where Citron Sid lived. As Leander rounded the corner onto his driveway, he saw Sid at his usual 3:45 p.m. antics. Sid was lying in the middle of the road, face down, panting. With each exhalation, dirt from the ground blew up in clouds. Leander thought about whether Sid sucked any into his mouth when he breathed in. He was eyeing up the rocks along his section of the driveway. He moved them exactly half a centimeter forward every morning, slowly expanding the boundary of his land 5 millimeters at a time. Abruptly pushing himself to his feet and saying a word Leander knew not to repeat, Sid brushed himself off and noticed Leander staring at him. "You tell your censored mum to stay off my mother censored property," he snapped. Leander's eyes widened. He watched Sid go into his house and slam the door. It wasn't the first time he heard that word, but normally when somebody said it around him, they immediately looked at the ground and apologized. Nobody had ever said it so proudly. Leander decided that he liked the word. It sounded strong and grown up, which, so his father told him, was exactly why he couldn't say it. He wasn't old enough to swear yet. At what point then, he wondered, would he be old enough to say censored? Going inside, Leander dumped his bag on the kitchen counter. No, not there. Put it over there, his mother said, gesturing that his bag belonged on a hook with the coats and not, in fact, in the way of everything. She was kneading dough on a pastry board. White flour speckled the curls in her hair. Unruly butter slid up her fingers. Their dog, Roscoe, sat at her feet, hoping that, in her clumsiness, she would drop the pastry altogether. "Mum," Leander said, helping himself to some apple juice from the fridge, "Citron Sid says you need to stop meddling." "For the last time, stop calling him that. He's just Sid." "Mum, just Sid says you need to stop meddling." You know what I meant? She began pushing a rolling pin over the dough before pulling out a ruler and making nicks in it with a knife. Why are you doing that for? Leander asked. Why are you doing that? Speak properly. Okay, why are you doing that? To make sure it's the right size for the casserole dish. What did Sid mean by meddling? I was moving those blooming rocks back. Why? Because the further out he puts them, the closer people drive to our property. So I don't want the road moved right by us, with traffic smashing into our hedges and leaving potholes along our driveway. I want the road where it is. Why don't you tell on him? I tried, she said, placing the dough into the dish and folding the edges up. I told the Reeves next door, but they went on again about how Sid's been here 40 years. They don't care. Bloody useless. She threw the pastry trimmings in the bin and Roscoe began to whine. Take the dog for a walk, Lee. But Mum, take him. You both need some fresh air and he's driving me balmy. I've just had a walk. I walked home from school. 2 won't kill you. Leander sighed and grabbed the leash, snapping it to Roscoe's collar. He took his keys from the front pocket of his school bag, put the backpack on its correct hook in the proper place, and went back outside. It was obvious to everyone that Sid earned his nickname from the dozen Citroen cars that littered his yard. They were his prized possessions, but he didn't treat them like they were important. Instead, they rotted and fell apart in the overgrown grass. Their metal corpses filled with rust. Weeds tangled themselves in the tires. Birds flew through smashed windows to peck stuffing from the seats. Every now and then, Sid would acquire another car for his graveyard at an auction, dump it with the others, and never look at it again. Rumours about this odd behaviour went around the school. Some said that Sid bought a Citroen every time he murdered someone and the bodies were buried in the yard under the cars. Leander shuddered as he walked past them. He doubted that this was true, but even murderers have to live somewhere, right? At least his mother refused to put up with Sid. Every morning she'd take Roscoe for a walk before she went to work, and on the way back home she'd kick all the rocks into the hedges. Then Sid would come out at 7:45 a.m. and put them all back a little closer to Leander's house, measuring the distance as accurately as he could after they had all been booted out of place. If he took care of those cars like he does with those blasted rocks, his yard wouldn't be such a tip, Leander's mother said. The walk with Roscoe went quickly. Leander didn't hate walking the dog. He'd just rather be doing something else, like watching his favourite cartoon, Marco and Rodney, a show about 2 space cowboys who went on intergalactic adventures. It was definitely for grown-ups because they used some pretty bad language, like what Sid said earlier. Leander's parents didn't know. They just figured it was a cartoon, so it was appropriate for him to watch. As long as Leander used his headphones, his mum and dad were none the wiser. When Leander walked past Citroen Sid's house coming home, he noticed something strange. The front door was open, but Sid wasn't anywhere to be seen. The detail that made it weird was the type of open the door was. It wasn't cracked or ajar. It was all the way open. In the years Leander had been living on Poppy Drive, Sid never left the door open. Overpowered by curiosity, Leander tightened his grip on Roscoe's leash and crept a little closer to Sid's house. He could see right through the living room in the front to the kitchen in the back. There was no movement, only the flickering of Citron Sid's kitchen light and his cemetery of cars. Leander gulped. Sneaking closer, treading the ground underneath him from the back of his heel to the tip of his toe, Leander craned his neck to see more. Still, there was no one. The carpet in the living room was thick and dark. It looked brown, though it could have been red, but it was hard to tell as all the curtains were pulled shut. The sofa was against the far wall, but all its cushions were on the floor by a tall, ominous bookcase. Nothing matched. Leander tied Roscoe to the fence post and drew in a deep breath. It didn't look like Sid was home. If he went inside, he'd be known at school as the boy who went into Citron Sid's house. He'd have the inside scoop. He might even be popular. Maybe Robbie Bakerfield would stop stealing his pocket money and want to be friends instead. The compulsion to go inside became too strong. As Marco and Rodney would say in their cartoon, buckle up and censored it. Leander stood in Citron Sid's doorway, his eyes adjusting to his surroundings. As he stepped inside, he was immediately hit with a smell he couldn't identify. It was like old bananas, but burned, similar to custard, but with a sour note. It resembled the warm milk that Leander liked before bed, but if it was microwaved in a plastic cup that had melted a little into the milk. Leander had no idea where it was coming from, but the whole house reeked of it. Everything was covered in dust, and it was clear that nothing had been disturbed in years. In the corner, there was a big square radio with huge black CDs. Leander had never seen anything like it. He sat down cross-legged in front of a large box full of the CDs and began to flick through them. As the first one fell forward, it shot dust out into his face and Leander coughed. Pulling his school shirt up over his nose, he browsed the rest of them. They were all names he'd never heard before. Fats Domino, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington. They looked old anyway, and, as Leander's schoolmates made him blatantly aware, nothing old was good. New was undoubtedly always better. Maybe that's why trees drop their old branches. They were just making room for better ones. Suddenly, the door behind him closed. Leander shot up off the floor. He spun around. Citron Sid towered above him, palms spread flat against the front door. "A visitor," Sid said. And that is the end of my extract. Thank you very much for listening. And if you want to find out what happens next, I strongly advise you purchase the book.